It was April of the year 1915, and the world was tearing itself apart. Across the fields of France and Belgium, men died by the thousands in mud-choked trenches, their bodies ground into the earth by artillery that never stopped, by machine guns that turned human waves into corpses before they could advance 10 yards. The Western Front had become a charnel house, a place where the old rules of war had been incinerated in the furnace of industrial killing. Cavalry charges ended in slaughter. Bayonet charges were suicide. Even the generals, those proud men in their pressed uniforms far behind the lines, were beginning to understand that this war would not be won by courage or tactics or the human spirit. It would be won by machines, by steel and oil and the cold mathematics of engineering. And nowhere was this truth more apparent than in the sky. The war had been raging for 8 months when Roland Garros returned to the skies above France in early April 1915. Garros was not a soldier by training. Before the war, he had been a gentleman aviator, a daredevil who set altitude records and performed at air shows across Europe. His name was known from Paris to St. Petersburg. He had been the first man to fly across the Mediterranean Sea, a feat that made him a celebrity overnight. Women sent him perfumed letters. Men bought him drinks in cafes. Children pointed at him in the streets and whispered his name like a prayer. But when the war began, Garros did what so many young men of his generation did. He volunteered. He joined the Aéronautique Militaire, the French Air Service, expecting to serve for a few months, maybe a year at most. Everyone said the war would be over by Christmas. But Christmas had come and gone, and the war was only getting worse. For the first months of his service, Garros flew reconnaissance missions. He would climb into his Morane-Saulnier Type L monoplane, a fragile thing of wood and canvas and wire, and soar over the German lines, photographing trench positions and artillery emplacements. It was dangerous work. German rifles cracked at him from below. Shells burst in black puffs around his wings. But he survived. He always survived. Garros had a gift for flying, an instinct that kept him alive when other pilots vanished into the mud. But reconnaissance wasn't enough for him. It felt passive, cowardly even. He wanted to fight. He wanted to hunt. And he began to obsess over a single, maddening problem. How do you shoot forward from an airplane when the propeller is in the way? It was the central question of aerial combat in early 1915, and no one had a good answer. Some pilots carried rifles and fired them one-handed while trying to control the stick with the other. It was absurd and ineffective. Others mounted machine guns on the upper wing, angled to fire over the propeller arc, but aiming required guesswork and luck. A few experimental designs placed the engine behind the pilot in a pusher configuration, which cleared the forward field of fire. But those planes were slow and cumbersome, easy prey for faster scouts. The ideal solution was obvious to everyone. Mount the gun directly in front of the pilot, aimed where he was already looking, so that flying and shooting became one seamless action, but the propeller made it impossible. Any bullet fired through the spinning blades would shatter the wood in seconds, and a shattered propeller meant a dead engine, and a dead engine meant a long, screaming fall to earth. Roland Garros thought about this problem every day. He sketched designs in his notebook. He consulted with mechanics. And finally, in late March 1915, he approached a man named Jules Hou, a gifted mechanic who worked in the hangars at Garros's airfield. Hugh was older than most of the pilots, in his 40s. with grease-stained hands and a mind that understood machines the way priests understand scripture. Garros explained the problem, and Hugh listened without interrupting. Then he said something that changed everything. "What if we armor the propeller?" Garros frowned. "Armor it? How?" Hugh picked up a propeller blade and tapped it with his knuckle. "The wood is the weak point, so we protect it. We bolt steel deflector plates to the blades at the points where bullets are most likely to hit. The bullets strike the plates and ricochet away. The propeller survives. The pilot keeps flying." It was crude, it was inelegant, and it was brilliant. Within a week, Hugh had fabricated a set of wedge-shaped deflector plates from hardened steel and bolted them to the propeller of Garros's Morane-Saulnier. They tested it on the ground first, mounting the plane on blocks and firing the machine gun while the engine ran at full throttle. Bullets struck the plates with sharp metallic cracks and spun off into the dirt. The propeller kept turning. Garros climbed into the cockpit and felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. On April 1st, 1915, Roland Garros took off from his airfield near Dunkirk and flew toward the German lines. He climbed to 10,000 feet, where the air was thin and cold, and the world below looked like a painted map. And then he saw it. A German Albatross two-seater lumbering along on a reconnaissance mission, its observers scanning the ground with binoculars, oblivious to the death descending from above. Garros dove. The Morane-Saulnier was fast in a dive, and the German crew didn't see him until it was too late. Garros lined up his shot, the way a hunter lines up a rifle on a stag, and he pressed the trigger. The Hotchkiss machine gun roared. Bullets tore through the Albatross's fuselage. The observer slumped over. The pilot tried to turn, but Garros stayed on him, firing in short, controlled bursts. Smoke poured from the German engine. The plane nosed over and fell, tumbling end over end, until it smashed into a field and exploded in a ball of orange flame. Garros pulled up, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. He had done it. He had killed from the front. And he knew in that moment that he had just invented a new kind of warfare. Over the next 2 weeks, Garros became a nightmare for the German air service. He shot down 4 more planes, always attacking from the front, always with that terrible, impossible forward-firing gun. German pilots didn't understand what was happening. They reported seeing tracer rounds coming at them from angles that shouldn't exist. Some thought the French had developed a new kind of weapon. Others whispered about black magic. The German High Command issued frantic orders. Find out how the French are doing this. Capture one of their planes. Kill the pilot. Do whatever it takes. But Garros was untouchable. He flew with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, diving into formations of German scouts, scattering them like sparrows. He became a hero in France, his name in every newspaper, his photograph on every wall. And then, on April 18th, 1915, his luck ran out. He was flying over Belgium, near the town of Ingelmunster, when German infantry opened fire from the ground. It was a lucky shot or an unlucky one, depending on perspective. A single rifle bullet punctured his fuel line. Gasoline streamed from the tank, and Garros knew immediately that he had minutes, maybe less, before the engine died. He turned toward friendly lines, but he was too deep in German territory. The engine coughed, sputtered, and went silent. The propeller windmilled uselessly, and Garros glided down into a field behind enemy lines, his aircraft settling into the mud with a crunch of splintering wood. He climbed out, shaking, and looked around. German soldiers were running toward him from a nearby farmhouse. He had seconds. He pulled out a matchbook, struck a flame, and tossed it onto the engine cowling, hoping the leaking fuel would ignite. But the fuel was too diluted with oil, and the fire sputtered and died. The soldiers reached him before he could try again. They dragged him away at gunpoint, and they saved his aircraft. Within hours, the Morin-Saulnier was loaded onto a flatbed truck and driven to a rail yard. Within a day, it was on a train to Berlin, and within 2 days, it was sitting in a workshop at the Döberitz military airfield, surrounded by German officers and engineers, who stared at the deflector plates like men staring at a revelation. This was the secret. This was how Garros had done it. And now, it belonged to Germany. The senior officer in charge of the inspection was a general major named Ernst von Höppner, a man with a sharp mind and no patience for excuses. He looked at the deflector plates, then at the engineers, and said, "I want this replicated. Immediately." One of the engineers, a cautious man with wire-rimmed spectacles, cleared his throat. "Sir, this system is primitive. It wastes ammunition. The deflector plates will weaken over time. There may be a better way." Von Höppner's gaze was cold. "Do we have a better way now?" "No, sir." "Then replicate it. We'll improve it later. Right now, I want every German fighter equipped with this system within a month." But there was one man in that workshop who disagreed. His name was Anthony Hermann Gerard Fokker, and he was standing in the corner, arms crossed, watching the engineers fuss over the deflector plates with a mixture of contempt and fascination. Fokker was 25 years old, short and stocky, with dark eyes that missed nothing and a mind that never stopped moving. He had been born in the Dutch East Indies, the son of a coffee plantation owner, and he had grown up building things: kites, model boats, gliders. And by the time he was a teenager, he was designing his own aircraft, teaching himself aerodynamics from books and trial and error. He had no formal engineering degree, no mentors, no connections, just an obsessive need to understand how things flew. In 1910, he had moved to Germany, where the aviation industry was booming, and by 1912, he had his own company, Fokker Aeroplanbau, building reconnaissance planes for the German military. His planes were good, reliable, fast, but they were scouts, not fighters, until now. Von Höppner noticed Fokker standing in the corner and gestured at him. "Herr Fokker, you've been quiet. What do you think?" Fokker stepped forward and ran his hand along one of the deflector plates. It was pitted and scarred from bullet impacts. "I think this is garbage," he said flatly. The room went silent. One of the engineers sputtered, "Garbage! This system has shot down 5 German aircraft." Fokker tapped the plate with his knuckle. It rang dully, like a cracked bell. "And how many French aircraft has it destroyed in the process? How many propellers has Garros gone through? How many times has he had to land and replace these plates because they were deformed from impacts?" This isn't engineering. It's desperation. It works because Garros is a brilliant pilot, but it's inefficient, unpredictable, and dangerous. Von Höppner leaned forward. "And I suppose you have a better idea?" Fokker met his gaze without hesitation. "I do." Von Höppner studied him for a long moment. Then he said, "You have 48 hours. If you can build something better, we'll test it. If you can't, we proceed with the French system." Fokker nodded. "Agreed." "And one more thing," Von Höppner added. "If your system works, you will demonstrate it personally, in combat." Fokker's expression didn't change, but something cold settled in his chest. In combat, you will fly to the front. You will engage an enemy aircraft, and you will destroy it. Those are the terms. Do you accept? Fokker looked at the deflector plates again, then at the Hotchkiss gun, then at the shattered propeller, and he said, I accept. Fokker left Döberitz that evening and took the train north to Schwerin, where his factory was located. It was a 2-hour journey through the German countryside, and he spent the entire trip staring out the window, thinking. He wasn't worried about building the synchronization gear. He had been thinking about the problem for months, sketching designs in his notebooks, running calculations in his head. He knew it was possible. The question wasn't whether he could build it. The question was whether he could live with what it would be used for. Fokker was Dutch. He had no loyalty to the Kaiser. He had no hatred for the French or the British. He was in Germany because the Germans paid well and gave him the resources to build aircraft. But now, those aircraft were going to be used to kill. And if he succeeded, if he built a weapon that worked, he would be responsible for every death that followed. He thought about refusing, about walking away. But he knew what would happen. The Germans would take his design anyway. They would build it without him. And if he refused, they would arrest him, intern him, maybe worse. He was trapped. So he decided to build the weapon. But he also decided, in that rattling train car as the sun set over the fields, that he would never use it to kill. By the time Fokker arrived at his factory in Schwerin, it was nearly midnight. But he didn't go to his quarters. He went straight to the workshop and woke his best men. There was Heinrich Lübe, his chief mechanic, a bear of a man with hands like sledgehammers and a mind for engines that bordered on genius. There was Fritz Kremer, a machinist who had worked in Swiss watch factories before the war, a man who could measure tolerances to the thousandth of an inch by feel alone. And there was Bernard de Waal, a Dutch engineer who understood gear ratios and mechanical linkages the way musicians understand harmony. Fokker gathered them around a work table, spread out his sketches, and said, "We have 48 hours to build something that doesn't exist yet." Lübe rubbed his eyes. "What doesn't exist?" Fokker tapped the sketch. "A gun that knows when not to fire." He explained the problem. The propeller rotates at a fixed speed, determined by the engine RPM. The machine gun fires at a fixed rate, determined by its mechanical cycle. If you could connect the two mechanically, you could synchronize them so that the gun only fired in the gaps between propeller blades. It was elegant. It was simple. And it had never been done before. De Waal leaned over the sketches, frowning. "You're talking about an interrupter gear, a cam system." Fokker nodded. "Exactly. A cam attached to the propeller shaft. Every time the shaft rotates, the cam pushes a lever. The lever blocks the trigger mechanism whenever a blade is in front of the barrel. The gun only fires when it's safe." Kremer stroked his chin. "The timing has to be perfect. If the cam is even a fraction of a degree off, the gun fires into the propeller and everything comes apart." "Then we make sure the cam is perfect," Fokker said. "We machine it to tolerances that don't allow for error. We lock it to the crankshaft with a direct drive. No belts, no chains. Solid steel." Lübe crossed his arms. "And what if the engine speed changes? What if the pilot throttles up or down in the middle of a fight?" Fokker smiled. "Then the cam speed changes with it. The system is always synchronized no matter the RPM." It was brilliant. It was terrifying. And it had to be done in 2 days. They worked through the night. Luba pulled an engine from one of FOKKER'S M5K monoplanes and mounted it on a test stand in the center of the workshop. It was a 9-cylinder Oberursel rotary engine, the same type used in most German Scouts, spinning at nearly 1,200 RPM at full throttle. The propeller was a 2-bladed wooden affair, each blade 8 feet long and carved to exacting specifications. Kremer took a solid steel rod and began machining the cam. It was delicate work. The cam had to be shaped so that it would engage the interrupter lever at precisely the right moment in the propeller's rotation. Too early, and the gun wouldn't fire at all. Too late, and the bullet would strike the blade. Kremer worked with micrometers and calipers, checking and rechecking every angle, every curve. His hands were steady, but his face was drawn with exhaustion. By dawn, he had the cam finished. Devail fabricated the linkage. It was a series of rods and pivots that translated the cam's rotation into a mechanical block on the machine gun's trigger. The gun they were using was a Spandau LMG 08/15, a German-made weapon that fired 7.92 millimeter rounds at a rate of around 450 rounds per minute. It was reliable, consistent, and deadly. Devail mounted the gun on a bracket in front of the test stand, aimed directly at the spinning propeller. Then he connected the linkage to the cam. The entire assembly looked fragile, almost absurdly simple. A cam no larger than a man's fist, a thin rod, a lever. That was all. But when Luba spun the propeller by hand, the lever moved in perfect rhythm, rising and falling in the tiny gaps between blade passes. Fokker watched in silence. Then he said, "Load the gun." Kremer hesitated. "If this fails, then we have 46 hours to fix it," Fokker interrupted. "Load the gun." Kremer loaded a belt of blank rounds into the Spandau. Blanks wouldn't damage the propeller if something went wrong, but they would show whether the timing was correct. Fokker stepped back and gestured at Luba. "Start the engine." Luba primed the fuel line, set the throttle, and pulled the propeller through 2 full rotations. The engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. The workshop filled with the smell of castor oil and exhaust. The propeller became a blur. Fokker pulled the trigger. The gun fired in short, controlled bursts. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, a hammering staccato that made the walls shake. But the propeller kept spinning. No impacts, no vibrations, no shattering wood, just the steady chatter of the Spandau and the whine of the engine. Fokker held the trigger for 5 seconds, 10, 15. Then he released it and shut down the engine. The propeller coasted to a stop. Fokker walked forward and inspected the blades. Not a single mark, not a scratch. Devail exhaled slowly. "Mein Gott, it works." Fokker allowed himself a small smile. "It works on the ground. Now we test it in the air." By the afternoon of the second day, the synchronization gear was installed in Fokker's personal M5K monoplane. The aircraft was painted a dull gray-green, with black iron crosses on the wings and fuselage. It was fast, nimble, and deadly. The Spandau machine gun was mounted directly in front of the cockpit, its barrel pointing forward through the propeller arc. Fokker climbed into the cockpit and ran through his pre-flight checks. The engine started smoothly. The controls responded. The synchronization gear moved freely. Everything felt right. But there was a difference between feeling right and being right, and the only way to know for certain was to fly. Fokker took off from the Schwerin airfield just before sunset. The sky was clear, the air cool and still. He climbed steadily, the engine purring beneath him, the wings trembling slightly in the slipstream. At 3,000 feet, he leveled off and tested the gun. He pulled the trigger in short bursts. The gun fired. The propeller spun. No impacts. He throttled up, increasing the engine RPM. The gun fired faster, but still in perfect rhythm. He throttled down. Slower bursts, still synchronized. He dove, pulling the stick back hard, feeling the G-forces press him into the seat. The gun kept firing in the gaps. He rolled left, then right, the horizon spinning around him. The synchronization held. Every maneuver, every change in speed and angle, the system worked. Fokker felt a surge of triumph. He had done it. In 48 hours, he had built a weapon that would change the course of the war. And he hated himself for it. He landed as the sun touched the horizon, taxied to the workshop, and shut down the engine. Luba was waiting, arms crossed, face tense with worry. "Well?" Fokker pulled off his leather helmet and goggles. "It works perfectly." Luba's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank God." "Don't thank him yet," Fokker said quietly. "Now I have to prove it to the Germans, and they want me to kill someone." That night, Fokker sat alone in his quarters, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. He thought about the men he would be expected to kill. Pilots, young men, probably no older than himself. Men with families, with dreams, with lives that had been interrupted by this war just like his own. He thought about pulling the trigger, about seeing the bullet strike home, about watching an aircraft fall, trailing smoke and flame, and knowing that he had ended a life. And he couldn't do it. He wasn't a killer. He was a builder, and there was a difference. The next morning, Fokker was summoned to Doberitz. He flew the M5K south, landing at the military airfield just after dawn. Von Höppner was waiting, along with 2 other senior officers and an engineering consultant from the Fliegertruppe. They inspected the synchronization gear with the thoroughness of men who had seen too many failures. The consultant examined the cam with a jeweler's loupe, checking tolerances, testing the linkage, searching for flaws. He spent nearly an hour on the inspection. Finally, he looked up and said, "In theory, this should work. The engineering is sound. But theory and practice are not the same thing. We need proof." Von Höppner nodded. "You will take this aircraft to the front. You will engage an enemy plane, and you will destroy it. Only then will we authorize production." Fokker kept his face neutral. "When do I leave?" "At dawn tomorrow. You'll be escorted by an observation plane to verify the kill. Do you understand?" "I understand." Von Höppner studied him for a long moment. "Is there a problem, Herr Fokker?" Fokker met his gaze. No problem. But there was. And Fokker spent the rest of that day and night thinking about how to solve it. He couldn't refuse the mission. That would mean arrest, imprisonment, maybe execution. The Germans didn't tolerate cowardice, especially from civilians profiting off the war. But he also couldn't kill an innocent man just to prove his machine worked. So he made a plan. He would fly to the front. He would search for a target, and he would make sure he didn't find one. At dawn, Fokker climbed into the M5K and took off from Doberitz. A German observation plane, an Albatros C-1, followed at a distance to verify the kill. Fokker flew west, toward the front lines, where the earth was scarred and broken, where the trenches cut across the landscape like wounds that would never heal. The morning was clear. Visibility was perfect. And within 20 minutes, Fokker spotted an Allied aircraft. It was a French Farman, A lumbering two-seater reconnaissance plane, slow and unarmed. The perfect target. The observer in the rear cockpit was scanning the ground with binoculars, making notes on a map. The pilot was focused on keeping the plane steady. Neither of them had seen Fokker yet. He was above them, hidden by the sun in the classic attack position. All he had to do was dive, line up his shot, and fire. It would take seconds. The fireman would never know what hit it. Fokker's hands tightened on the control stick. He pushed the stick forward, entering a dive. The M5K accelerated rapidly, the wind screaming past the fuselage. The fireman grew larger in his gun sight. 500 meters, 400, 300. The details became clear. He could see the observer's leather coat, the pilot's white scarf, the French roundels on the wings. 200 meters. His thumb hovered over the trigger. All he had to do was press. Just a short burst, a few seconds, and it would be over. The synchronization gear would be proven. The contract would be signed. His company would be secure. But his finger wouldn't move. He thought about the men in that Farman. The pilot, young, probably younger than Fokker. Maybe this was his first mission. Maybe he had a sweetheart back home, someone waiting for him. The observer, older, maybe a father. Maybe he had children who called him Papa, who waited for his letters, who prayed for his safe return. They weren't Fokker's enemies. They were just men, and he couldn't kill them. Fokker pulled up sharply, breaking off the attack. The fireman flew on, unaware how close it had come to death. The observer kept scanning. The pilot kept flying. And Fokker climbed back to altitude, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. He had failed, or succeeded. He wasn't sure which. He circled for another 20 minutes, pretending to search for targets. He flew along the front lines, scanning the sky, making sure the observation plane following him could see he was trying. He spotted 2 more Allied aircraft, both of them vulnerable, both of them easy kills. And both times, he found reasons not to engage. The first was too far away. The second was flying too low. Excuses, lies, but necessary ones. Finally, as his fuel ran low, he turned back toward Doberitz. When he landed, von Höppner was waiting. His face was unreadable. Well? Fokker climbed out of the cockpit, pulled off his helmet, and shrugged. No targets. The sky was empty. Von Höppner's eyes narrowed. The observer reported you engaged a Farman. Fokker met his gaze without flinching. I investigated a contact. It turned out to be one of ours. The markings were unclear from above. I broke off to avoid a friendly fire incident. It was a flimsy lie, and both men knew it. But von Höppner couldn't prove otherwise. The observation plane had been too far away to see the Farman's markings clearly. And Fokker's excuse, while suspicious, was plausible enough. Von Höppner stepped closer. You're lying, Herr Fokker. Fokker said nothing. The silence stretched. Finally, the engineering consultant who had inspected the synchronization gear spoke up. It doesn't matter. Both Fokker and von Höppner turned to him. The consultant gestured at the M5K. The system works. We saw it fire during the test flights. The engineering is sound. The synchronization is proven. Whether or not Herr Fokker has the nerve to use it in combat is irrelevant. Our pilots will. Von Höppner looked like he wanted to argue, but he couldn't. The consultant was right. The test that mattered had already been passed. Fokker's cowardice, if that's what it was, didn't change the fact that the weapon worked. Von Höppner turned back to Fokker. Your contract is approved. You will begin production immediately. We want 20 units within the month. And Herr Fokker? Yes? If you ever fly for us again, you will follow orders. Is that understood?" Fokker nodded. Understood. But he knew he would never fly for them again. Within 2 weeks, the first Fokker-EY monoplanes, equipped with synchronized machine guns, arrived at the front. They were assigned to Germany's best pilots, men like Max Immelmann and Oswald Boelcke, men who had no hesitation, no doubt, no moral conflict about what they were being asked to do. And they were devastatingly effective. Immelmann scored his first kill on August 1st, 1915, shooting down a British BE-2C over Douai. The British pilot never saw him coming. The synchronized gun allowed Immelmann to attack from directly behind, where the enemy observer's gun couldn't reach. It was slaughter. Boelcke followed with his first kill days later. Then another, and another. By September, the Fokker-Eindecker, as it became known, was dominating the skies over the Western Front. Allied pilots began to fear it. They called it the Fokker Scourge. German pilots, emboldened by their technological advantage, became aggressive, hunting Allied reconnaissance planes like wolves hunting sheep. The British Royal Flying Corps suffered catastrophic losses. In September 1915 alone, they lost over 100 aircraft. Pilots were being killed faster than they could be trained. The life expectancy of a new RFC pilot at the front dropped to 11 days. 11 days. French squadrons fared little better. The Newport scouts they were flying were nimble, but their guns were mounted on the upper wing, making aiming difficult. German pilots learned to exploit this, attacking from below and behind, where the French couldn't return fire. The death toll mounted. And Anthony Fokker, sitting in his factory in Schwerin, read the reports and felt the weight of what he had built. He had changed the war. He had given Germany air superiority, and thousands of men were dying because of it. But Fokker tried not to think about that. He told himself that he was just a builder, that what men chose to do with the things he built was not his responsibility. He focused on production, on improving the design, on building more planes. The German military was ecstatic. They awarded him contracts. They paid him enormous sums. They treated him like a hero. But at night, alone in his quarters, Fokker would lie awake and think about that morning over the front lines, about the fireman he could have killed, about the 2 men inside it who were probably still alive, who had no idea how close they had come to death. And he would wonder if he had made the right choice. He had built a weapon, but he had refused to use it. Did that make him a coward, or did it make him something else? He never found a satisfying answer. The Fokker Scourge lasted until the spring of 1916, when the Allies finally developed counter-weapons. The British introduced the Airco DH-2, a pusher biplane that could match the Fokker's speed and maneuverability. The French deployed the Newport 11, a scout with a synchronized gun of its own. The technological advantage shifted. German pilots began to die. The Fokker-EY, once invincible, became obsolete. And the cycle continued. Better planes, better guns, better tactics. The war in the air evolved at a terrifying pace, each side leapfrogging the other, each innovation leading to new ways to kill. And at the center of it all was Anthony Fokker, the man who had started it. He continued to design aircraft throughout the war. The Fokker Doctor, a triplane, the Fokker D-7 biplane, each one more advanced than the last, each one more deadly. By the time the war ended in 1918, Fokker was one of the wealthiest men in Europe. He had built an empire on death. But he never forgot that morning in April 1915, when he had been ordered to kill and had chosen to lie instead. In his autobiography, written years later, Fokker described that moment as the most important decision of his life. Not because it was heroic, not because it was moral, but because it reminded him that building a weapon and using it are two very different things. One requires knowledge, the other requires killing, and only one of them forces you to look another human being in the eye before you pull the trigger. Fokker had built the gun that changed aerial warfare forever. He had invented the synchronized machine gun, the weapon that turned fragile reconnaissance planes into deadly hunters, that created the concept of the fighter ace, that made the sky a battlefield. But when given the chance to use it himself, he had turned away. And that choice, more than any machine he ever built, defined who Anthony Fokker really was. Not a soldier, not a killer, just a man who understood machines better than he understood war, and who, when forced to choose between profit and conscience, chose something in between. He built the weapon, but he refused to pull the trigger. And in the end, that was the only victory he ever claimed.